But then you can take disciplines that are pure junk, and they've been established as being pure junk in the wake of this 2009 National Academy of Sciences report. And a great example of that is bite mark evidence. What the community of forensic odontologists would claim, and that's what they call themselves, is that people's teeth make unique impressions in skin. Once there was this effort to try to validate the discipline, what it actually did was completely invalidate the discipline. And so once there were studies that were actually done, and this is years after this evidence was used in court to convict people and send them to death row and send them to prison for life, after many cases in which that had been done, finally the studies are done. And what they show is that just as a threshold question, is it a bite mark? There was like wide disagreement about even that threshold determination.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Lonely Podcast. On this episode, I'm speaking with Anne-Marie Moyes, who is the director of the Korey Wise Innocence Project based out of the University of Colorado, Boulder, where she also teaches classes on wrongful convictions. Prior to joining the organization, Anne-Marie worked for both the state and federal public defender's offices and worked as a trial attorney for over a decade. Anne-Marie participated personally in multiple cases of exoneration. So for those of you who don't know, the Korey Wise Innocence Project is an organization dedicated to assist prisoners who are wrongfully convicted to achieve exoneration and advocate for policy reform at the state level. In our conversation, we talk about the credibility of forensic evidence, how wrongful convictions are obtained, the repercussions against police and prosecutors for mishandling a case and withholding evidence, the administrative and legal obstacles in achieving exonerations, and what are policy reforms we should advocate for. Finally, I would say that I really wanted to speak with Anne-Marie simply because I believe that the work that she's doing in her organization is essential for the health and well-being of the American criminal justice system. So, please welcome Anne-Marie Moyes. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for coming on. And I wanted to start by asking if you can, give a little bit of background of what you do exactly with the Korey Wise Innocence Project and what is the project focused on.
Okay. So my name is Anne-Marie Moyes, and I'm the executive director of the Korey Wise Innocence Project. We're an innocence organization that's based at the University of Colorado Law School. There are projects like ours all across the United States, and we're the project that serves Colorado. So what we aim to do is identify cases of wrongful conviction in Colorado, and then we provide free legal services to people who we think are factually innocent. We try to develop new evidence of their innocence, and we try to get them out of prison. But paired with that, what we also do is try to leverage those stories of injustice to create change. So at the policy level, we try to implement reforms or lobby for reforms to the criminal legal system to make it less likely, to reduce the frequency of wrongful convictions at the front end, and to make it easier to correct them when they do happen.
Got it. And how did you end up becoming the director of the Korey Wise Innocence Project? I'm curious to know.
Yeah. So I was a public defender for a number of years before I took this job in 2019. So that was mostly in Tennessee, and I worked as a trial level public defender in Nashville for 2 years. And then I moved to the federal defender system, and in the office for the Middle District of Tennessee, I was an attorney there for 11 or 12 years. And in that role, I mainly did federal habeas work and appellate work. Oh, and I mean, over the course of that time, I had several cases of wrongful conviction that I worked on, and I was successful in a few of those cases of getting people out. And that just really lit a fire in me of wanting to do this work full time if I could. So I was really fortunate that once I moved to Colorado, the position opened at the Korey Wise Innocence Project, and I had the right kind of background to get the job.
Can you give like overview of the history of the Innocence Project, how it started?
Okay. Well, just if you look nationally, Innocence Project started after DNA became available as a tool of exoneration. So, when we look pre-DNA, the conventional wisdom really was that false confessions rarely happened, that wrongful convictions were a rarity. I mean, there were people in the criminal defense community who believed otherwise, but the broader conventional wisdom was to be really skeptical about wrongful convictions. And then DNA became available as this tool to exonerate, and it just sort of lifted the veil back and showed the brutal truth of what's really happening in our criminal legal system, that people, it's not a rarity that people falsely confess to crimes, that eyewitness misidentification happens more often than we like to think, and on and on. And so Innocence Project sprang up really when DNA became available, because it was this amazing tool to look backwards and try to get justice for people who had been wrongfully convicted. First and biggest project in New York sprang up, which was started by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. And then it became this kind of cascade where you had these exonerations happening from DNA, and it really captured people's attention, and it captured the attention of the legal community. And then you see Innocence Projects spring up in different regions in different states. And so the story in Colorado is that there were some lawyers at a civil litigation firm, I think it was Arnold and Porter, and there was a lawyer there named Jim Scarborough, and he saw what was happening nationally, and he thought, we need to make sure that this effort is also happening in Colorado. And so they started a project here that was really just kind of like a clearinghouse, where they would accept applications from people in prison claiming innocence. And then if they, through their own screening, believed that it could in fact be a case, or likely was a case of wrongful conviction, they would then try to find a lawyer in the legal community to take the case. They didn't actually do the legal work themselves. And then at some point, the project moved to the University of Colorado Law School, and it kind of stayed in that form for a long time, where it didn't have funding, it didn't have staff, but a clinical law professor kind of did it as a side project in that clearinghouse model of just really trying to identify cases that could be wrongful convictions and then farming them out to outside lawyers. And finally, I'm trying to remember the year, I guess it was about 2016, 2017, Anne England, who is our faculty director, she finally was able to get funding to kind of start a real project. And the funding initially came from Korey Wise, who's one of the members of the exonerated 5 out of the Central Park jogger case. And so he made a generous gift. And then the project was founded in its current form of having a real viable staff project that not only identified cases of likely wrongful conviction, but then did the legal work to try to get those people out, and also did the policy work to take advantage of, in a sense, these stories of injustice to try to push for policy change to improve the whole landscape.
And just so people can understand, can you give a range of how many applications you receive and how many of them can you actually process?
So we are still a fairly small project. We have 5 full-time lawyers, and then Anne is our faculty director. So we're a staff of 6. And so there's a limited number of cases that we can work on at any one time because they're really time consuming. It's really challenging to develop new evidence of innocence, and then it often is a real fight in court to get the person out. So, our bandwidth, despite having 5 full-time attorneys, is not that broad. And so we do have a backlog of applications that are just waiting for us to review. So how many applications do we get in? Wow, I would say we get in probably 3 to 5 applications a month. And, that just unfortunately continues to kind of feed this backlog, because it's just really hard to get on top of it. But like most innocence projects, I always kind of describe it to people like a funnel, is that you have all these applications that come in the top, and you're sort of winnowing it down based on two primary questions that you're asking. One is, does this person have a credible claim of factual innocence? And two, do we see that there are viable avenues to developing new evidence that could possibly get that person back in court and possibly free them? And sometimes you answer the first question, yes. You answer the first question that this person's story of innocence makes sense, but you just don't see the possible avenues to developing anything new that could help them. So it's based on those questions that we kind of narrow down to the cases that we think are most promising, where we're most likely going to be able to help that person.
Yeah, and we can touch later on what you keep saying, that whether you can factually basically prove, which it takes away whether you believe this person committed or did not commit the crime, but it's like the threshold of entry here is really, 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 really high, and it's actually really hard.
Yes.
To reverse a case that was already decided.
Absolutely. Yeah, once somebody's been convicted, it's extremely difficult to overturn a conviction, and courts are very skeptical, or reluctant, I should say, to overturn convictions.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can talk about, it's a good segue to ask you about what is wrongful conviction, basically.
So in the innocence community, we define that term as people who are factually innocent but have been wrongfully convicted of that crime. And so we distinguish, just in the work that we take on, between people that might have a legal defense but aren't factually innocent. So an example of that would be if somebody acted in self-defense. They may be not guilty of a crime, but that's not a case of factual innocence. That's a case where there was a pure legal defense to the action. And then, in terms of a wrongful conviction, there's people define that differently. There's an organization called the National Registry of Exonerations, and their definition, I'm not going to say it exactly perfectly, but it's that somebody's conviction was overturned by some mechanism. And that mechanism could be that a court overturned the conviction. It could be that a governor pardoned the person. It could be from executive action or court action, but somewhere in the mix of the basis for overturning the conviction was some evidence of innocence. And if the person's conviction was overturned, then there has to be a following step of either that they were acquitted at a retrial, or the charges were dismissed because the state decided not to retry. But there are definitely people who were wrongfully convicted of crimes whose cases don't count. For example, their conviction might have been overturned, and then they were offered a deal by the state that instead of waiting 2 to 3 years in jail for a new trial, we'll let you out today if you just enter this lesser plea. You can maintain your innocence, but you still walk away with a conviction. And so there are people, who I believe are factually innocent and were wrongfully convicted, whose cases don't count by the definition of someplace like the National Registry of Exoneration.
So when you say factually innocent, you mean that there is some sort of an evidence that completely exonerate the person, for usually DNA based?
Yeah, it really varies. I mean, the cases can look so different. So let me give you an example. Let's say you had somebody who comes back to court, they're attacking their conviction, and they have a range of claims. And one of the claims they have is what we call a Brady claim, where they're saying that at the time of trial, the state, either the prosecution or the police, had some favorable evidence that pointed to innocence that they were supposed to turn over as a matter of due process, and instead they withheld that evidence. Then you would have a due process claim that you did not have a fair trial because the state failed to share this favorable evidence with you that could have helped you to prove your innocence. So that person's conviction could be overturned on a Brady claim. It's a constitutional claim, but baked within that claim is evidence of innocence, right? And so it's not a claim like a freestanding claim of evidence. It's not a new evidence claim. It's actually a constitutional due process claim. But that would count as a wrongful conviction if the person were then acquitted at a retrial or if the state elected not to retry them.
There are a multiplicity of cases where actually the prosecution withheld evidence that could have assisted someone to receive, to be acquitted, and that just like did not happen. So how do you deal with this type of situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's so many issues in there. I mean, there's a question of the case in front of you. We definitely have cases where we want to explore that possibility to find out if there was any evidence withheld. And it can be difficult just to get the files that help you prove that. Just getting access to complete police and prosecution files is not always easy in the post-conviction context. So I think, if you're talking about on a policy front, I think that we should have stronger open records laws that make it easier for people to get full access to all of that evidence and all of those records in the post-conviction context. I think there's also a question of, we see this pattern of prosecutorial misconduct, of official misconduct in case after case of wrongful conviction. But what are we doing to change that landscape? I mean, the truth is that if you're talking about prosecutors that do withhold evidence, there's rarely a professional consequence for them. So part of what innocence projects have collectively been trying to do is shift that picture and just kind of try to create change where there would be more accountability for prosecutors. But it's difficult. If you look at the stats, and I don't have them right in front of me, it's astounding how few prosecutors face some sort of consequence when they engage in that misconduct.
And what is there like a basis for that? Like having basically make it so difficult so that the prosecutor will be protected, even if they did something that is obviously like a misconduct.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is when you're talking about just civil suit, prosecutors enjoy absolute immunity.
Right.
And so, that makes it difficult to hold them accountable through a civil rights lawsuit. But then, on the ethics side and the ethics committees, the bar, whether the bar holds them accountable is a different sort of question. And I think there's just a history of those bodies being pretty deferential to prosecutors' sort of explanations of not acting intentionally, of it somehow not being their personal responsibility that the evidence wasn't turned over. They're just, often you have people in those bodies who themselves aren't criminal practitioners or certainly not criminal defense lawyers. And there's just a long history of being reluctant to disrupt somebody's career in the face of those kind of charges. Or they're not charges, what would it be? That sort of complaint, I guess you would call it.
I guess you do in some way want to have a high threshold for this type of complaint, just because if you have a low threshold, after every conviction, you're going to have a complaint laid against the prosecution, or potentially. Obviously, the threshold now is very, very high. And so that is probably the logic behind that, I'm assuming.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I think that's the logic behind absolute immunity, is that the philosophy undergirding that is that prosecutors have to make these difficult judgment calls all the time, and that you don't want that contaminated in a bad way by their fear of being sued. But, when you look at how egregious many of these violations are, it's hard to kind of square that with that underlying justification. Because it's pretty egregious what often happens, that there's evidence that clearly was exculpatory and it's right in the prosecutor's file, and they made a decision not to turn it over. It's often pretty black and white.
Mm-hmm. And do you have an example of one of those cases, like a real life example of some of these situations? Yeah.
So we just had a case where we were able to get somebody out of prison, but he did enter an Alford plea. But he was convicted of a robbery kidnapping crime. It was a case that happened in Denver where the true perpetrator approached a woman in the parking garage of a shopping mall and ordered her to get in her car and drive to a nearby bank to cash a check. And our client, his name is Jason Hogan, was convicted almost solely based on the victim's eyewitness identification of him. So he had been on the police's radar because he was a suspect in another completely unrelated crime, and they decided to put him in what's called the 6-pack, which is just a group of 6 photos that was shown to an eyewitness, in this case being the victim. And she ended up picking his picture out. So it was not a really strong ID for a couple of reasons. One being that she initially told police that she had not gotten a good look at the perpetrator's face. And secondly, that she described the perpetrator as having a tattoo on his hand. And Jason Hogan, our client, did not have a tattoo on his hand, but the jury convicted him anyway. So in our investigation, we ended up finding out that a second crime took place at the same mall in the same parking garage 5 days later. And for a year or two, we tried to get records of that other crime, and we were repeatedly told that all the records had been destroyed. But we were just really persistent, and we kept asking for different parts of the record. We kept asking different ways, different people. And finally, on like the 6th attempt, we ended up getting the police reports from this second crime that happened 5 days later at the same location. And what we found out is the police concluded that the same person committed both crimes because the MO was so unique and specific in that there was a male of the same general physical description who approached a woman on the first floor of the parking garage, who told her he was desperate for money, who ordered her back into her car, who told her he wanted her to drive to a nearby bank and cash a check. So pretty unusual and identical. So the police logically concluded same person. But then in the second case, they showed that victim a 6-pack, and the 6-pack included Jason Hogan's picture. And she not only didn't pick him out, but she said, the guy's not in here. You know, the guy who did this to me, I don't see him here. I don't think any of these people are him. And then they lifted prints from the area of her car where he had been sitting, and they had a good print, and they compared it to Jason Hogan, and it didn't match him. And then the victim had described the perpetrator as having a heavily pockmarked complexion, and that was another physical feature besides the tattoo that absolutely didn't match Jason. He didn't have any sort of acne scarring on his face. So they should have turned all of that evidence over to him, because that's really helpful, and it could have really helped him defend himself at his trial for the first case, that you have this second crime, every reason to believe that the same person did both of them, and lots of reason to conclude that he absolutely didn't do the second one. If the same person did both, then he also didn't do the first one, right? But the police just buried all of that. They never turned it over. I mean, it's unclear whether they gave it to the prosecution, but at a minimum, the police were guilty of misconduct for not turning it over. And so now, our client got out, but there's no accountability for the people who made decisions not to share that information with him. And then he lost years of his life because of a decision that they made at some point in time not to give that to him.
Yeah, this is it's so heartbreaking and so upsetting to read about those things.
Yeah.
And to see that it's actually happening to real people, and especially when you get the opportunity to see this person in real life, it's just it's heartbreaking, honestly.
It absolutely is. The Michael Morton case is a really famous example of prosecutorial misconduct. It's a Texas case, but the reason it's so famous is because I think it's the only, at least known case of a prosecutor doing jail time for having withheld evidence. And what happened was Michael Morton was wrongfully convicted of killing his wife. And so he had gone to work, and then he's at work, and he gets a call from the police, and I can't remember how his wife's body was discovered, but she was murdered in their home. And the son, their young son, who was 3 or 4 years old, was home at the time of the crime. And the child ended up telling his grandmother that there was a monster in the house who killed his mom, who hurt his mommy. And then the grandmother said, "Was it Daddy?" And he said, "No, Daddy wasn't home." And they had this, information in their file, and they did not turn it over to the defense. I think they also had evidence that the victim's credit card had been used, like, once Michael Morton, the wrongfully convicted man, the husband, was already in jail. Somebody had used the wife's credit card that had been stolen from the house. So they had this pretty strong evidence that he didn't do it, and they just completely withheld it. And the only reason why the prosecutor served any jail time, which was something like a week, it was a really short amount of time, was because at the time of trial, the defense suspected something fishy, and they, on the record in court, they sort of forced the prosecutor to say to the court that he had turned over everything. And because he had made that representation to the court that was false, then he was held in contempt of court, but did something like 5 to 7 days. It was a really short amount of time that he did in jail. But it's, sort of this notorious case of not only an extreme violation, but just like the one case where, at least there was some consequence, albeit like pretty minimal.
Yeah, the consequences came, but it actually came indirectly from the misconduct related to the case.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
It did not actually came from that wasn't the reason, the actual reason.
It was because of the false representation.
Yes.
About that fact.
About the case, yes, but not the fact that he withheld the evidence.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Well, that's it's again, it's pretty. Honestly, it's the thing that I think about the most when I see those things. It's pretty scary, because a lot of those situations, you can be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and all of a sudden you find yourself, in prison for an extended amount of time, and your ability to actually do something about it's very limited.
Yeah, agreed. It can happen to anybody.
Yes, that's something that, looking into some of these cases, that's something that really made me reflect a lot. Is, oh wow, this, like, I could have been in this situation, giving if I'm in the wrong circumstances. And I think a lot of people, especially young men, can find themselves can think back into some situations where they were really close to do something very, very stupid, or maybe did something stupid but got away with it. And it's kind of it's a lot of it is a question of luck.
Yeah, that is true. Also, just some of us just make bad decisions about who we hang out with at a certain point in our life.
Yes.
You're proximate to something that happens. It's very easy to get wrongly pulled into suspicion.
Yeah, definitely. And because okay, so I have a zoom out question, like a 30,000 foot question.
Correct.
Okay. Do you think the American criminal justice system is working well?
Wow, that's such a big picture question. I do not think so. There's so many reasons to object to it, but I know we're here talking about wrongful convictions today, and I think we have a system that tolerates too high of an error rate. I think we also have a system of mass incarceration in this country, where the machinery of the criminal justice system is just so massive in terms of how many people are moving through this system, that this system doesn't really have the resources always to give each case what it deserves, whether that's high quality legal representation from a defense lawyer that has a caseload that's low enough so that they can give truly adequate representation to every person. There are just so many things that are broken about the system, and I think wrongful convictions is a sort of lens in that allows us to see through these individual cases and the patterns that we see in them just how flawed the system really is.
And what do you think are the fundamental flaws of the system?
Well, if you look at wrongful convictions and you look at the patterns and the common features of those cases, you can see these features that repeat again and again and again. And so what you see is something between 20 and 30% of those cases involve mistaken eyewitness identification. So, if you talk one by one about one at a time about these contributing factors, there are real policy choices that we make where we definitely have the power to reduce that dramatically as a contributing factor. It's a choice whether we do that or not. So, for example, with mistaken eyewitness ID, there's all kinds of social science research that shows that, one, human memory is very flawed. And so it's always going to be imperfect, but there are things that we can do to reduce the risk of a mistaken ID. One thing that we could do is to try to create a higher threshold before somebody could be in a lineup. Like, rather than being able to put anybody in there who, with just like mild suspicion that they might be the right person, you could have some sort of standard of probable cause or something else before somebody ends up in a lineup, because there's such a high risk of misidentification once the lineup happens. But also there's all sorts of things that you can do within police practices that reduce the risk of a mistaken ID. One thing the police should definitely do, they should record the identification process from start to finish so you can see any even inadvertent contamination of that process. The police officer who conducts the identification should not know who the suspect is. When a lineup is constructed, a photo lineup, there's one suspect and there's 5 fillers. Like, the fillers are people that the police have no reason to suspect committed the crime. They're just there because they supposedly match the description of the suspect. But what studies show is that when the police know who the true suspect is, there's a lot of things that they can do, even if accidental, that contaminate the process. So, for example, often what happens in a case is a victim makes an identification and they might be pretty uncertain of it when they first make it, but then the police say, "Good job, that's who we thought it was." And then, there are these studies that show that the witness's confidence goes from being fairly low to all of a sudden being really high, and they'll come in court and say that they could never forget that face, and they're 100% sure, when that wasn't really what they were feeling when they first made the identification. So, there's things that we can do that aren't that hard. They might take a little more resources, to make sure that you have an officer in the room who's not related to the case, doesn't know who the suspect is. But there's just really pragmatic solutions to a lot of things that could make a real difference that we're not universally doing.
Yeah, and what are the methods? Because when we talked, you mentioned there's a lot of methods, whether these are tools that were used in a crime scene, and
Right.
and like some of the methods the prosecution uses in order to get a conviction, like
Right.
the forensic methods,
Right.
basically.
So
Like
that's another space within, the criminal legal system that is really problematic. So most forensic disciplines or techniques were developed by law enforcement. They were developed as tools to solve crimes, and they weren't developed within the pure sciences. So one exception to that is DNA. And DNA is really distinct from a lot of these other disciplines. Most of these other disciplines are called pattern comparison methods, where there's a pattern like a fingerprint, and then you have somebody trained to look at these patterns in, let's say a print taken from the crime scene and then sample prints from the suspect and make a determination about the likelihood that they came from the same source. But this is such a big area. I'm going to just read you a quote quick. After there were a lot of exonerations through DNA, there was pressure put on Congress to try to do something about it. And specifically, there was lobbying to have Congress have the National Academy of Sciences do a real deep dive into the state of forensics and issue a report. And what the National Academy of Sciences concluded was with the exception of nuclear DNA analysis, no forensic method has been rigorously shown to have the capacity to consistently and with a high degree of certainty demonstrate a connection between evidence and a specific individual or source. So they're basically saying, yes, DNA valid, but all these other disciplines, even if they could be sufficiently validated, that hasn't happened, at least at the time of the 2009 NAS report. So, we could look at two examples. One would be fingerprints. So, there's a couple of things that underlie, like assumptions that underlie a lot of these pattern comparison disciplines. One is the assumption that every person on the planet has a unique print, and that certain patterns that you see just don't repeat among people. But who's done the research to prove that? At the time of the 2009 report, that was an assumption, and fingerprint examiners would come in court and say it, that no two people on the planet have the same print. But it's different to do studies that actually prove that, and prove at the rate at which certain patterns may repeat. Because often when a print is lifted from a crime scene, it might be smudged. It could be a partial print. It's not the perfect print that occurs when somebody rolls their full fingerprint, to get this perfect pristine print when they're printed at the police station, right? So in the wake of the NAS report, there was pressure on the fingerprint community to validate their discipline. And so they did do some what you call black box studies, where they basically had examiners look at different prints and just try to at least establish an error rate of, just to validate that even if you couldn't, there's a lot that's sort of not super established about their methodology, but could you at least prove that their methodology gets it right a high percentage of the time? And with fingerprints, what it showed once those studies were done is it showed there is an error rate, because fingerprint examiners before these studies used to say there was pretty much a 0% error rate. That's not true. There's something, I think there's one study that shows a 1 to 2%, 3% error rate. There's another study that shows an 11% error rate. So not insignificant that you would have some error rate, right? So that's at least a discipline where it's been, there's been effort to validate it, and there's been some success in showing that it has some real validity, albeit with an error rate, right? But then you can take disciplines that are pure junk, and they've been established as being pure junk in the wake of this 2009 National Academy of Sciences report. And a great example of that is bite mark evidence. So bite mark evidence is, sometimes in crimes, the perpetrator will end up biting the victim. I mean, really awful facts in some of these crimes, right? Just really brutal, violent crimes. But what the community of forensic odontologists would claim, and that's what they call themselves, is that people's teeth make unique impressions in skin, and that they have a method where they could determine, what to a person, or who made this mark, whose teeth made this mark on skin. And once there was this effort to try to validate the discipline, what it actually did was completely invalidate the discipline. And so once there were studies that were actually done, and this is years after this evidence was used in court to convict people and send them to death row and send them to prison for life, after many cases in which that had been done, finally the studies are done. And what they show is that just as a threshold question, is it a bite mark? Among forensic odontologists, there was wide disagreement about even that threshold determination. So they would send these impressions out to different experts. A third of them would say, I can't tell if it's a bite mark. A third of them would say, it's a bite mark. A third of them would say, it's not a bite mark. So just threshold question beyond, not even to the point of, can I identify the source of this bite mark? Just, is it a bite mark? Vast disagreement among the experts. So it basically, through these studies that were finally done, it just showed that it is actually pure junk. And it makes sense, right? Because when you think of skin and you think of somebody's teeth, there's all different angles that somebody can be, approaching, that is going to affect the impression that's made. Skin itself is so malleable that, again, that's going to affect the type of impression is made. So there's just these broad, in the scientific community, they call range of freedom. There's all these different variables that are going to affect the kind of impression made. And the very notion that you could discern from, sometimes there were examiners that would only see 2-3 impressions on skin, and they would try to say that through those few impressions that they could determine whose teeth made those impressions. I mean, when you really start to drill down, you see, like, of course that's preposterous, right? But it didn't stop this community from convicting a lot of people before finally it came under scrutiny.
And is it still being used to some extent?
I don't actually know for sure how often it's currently being used, but that's a really great question. I think that it would be harder for it to be used in the wake of these studies, but I don't know that there are yet decisions or a lot of decisions where courts have just excluded it altogether. I would think a prosecutor would have a harder time admitting it now in the wake of the studies that were finally done, because they could be confronted, with how unreliable the technique actually is.
Yeah. Yeah, that goes back to the question of quality of, defense attorneys. And because the pattern that I've seen in some cases is that a lot of the folks who are wrongfully convicted, better what is the percentage there, but a lot of them, they don't have the means to actually find a good defense attorney.
Yeah, I mean, that will really vary state by state of what kind of resources a defense lawyer has, like a public defender or an appointed attorney, to experts that could help push back. And, Evie, I know you remember from your legal studies, I mean, there are mechanisms in the law that should keep this evidence from ever coming to court, right? I mean, we have a rule of evidence, that's supposed to be set a threshold for reliability of what kind of scientific or expert evidence comes into court. And there's these big cases from the US Supreme Court that try to sort of define this landscape and give courts a lot of guidance about when they should let evidence in or not, right? So, it should be on the state to prove that their discipline is sufficiently reliable in order to be able to admit it at a trial, and at which somebody's very liberty is at stake. Often what happens is courts just cite other courts that have let this evidence in, and it just becomes this slow creep where more and more courts let it in, and then it's deemed to be kind of established, and nobody really wants to question or even put in jeopardy some of these older cases in which it was used.
Yeah. Can you take us to the sorry? Can you take us to the process of exoneration? How does it look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. It looks really different in different cases. And so, if I were to tell you a little bit about our caseload, the breadth of cases that we have some cases where we're representing people in their initial post-conviction proceedings. And so, for people not familiar with criminal law, there's different phases or tracks that a person, avenues that people have to challenge their conviction. They first have something called a direct appeal, then they have a second go through state court called post-conviction. So we get some cases where a person hasn't exhausted all of their traditional appeals yet. And so we'll represent them in post-conviction, where we raise the full breadth of issues, innocence issues and non-innocence issues, and we just raise everything to challenge the conviction. And then maybe more commonly, we have cases where somebody has exhausted all of those traditional avenues of appeal. And then our task is, can we come up with something new that is a basis to get somebody back in court and have a court reconsider their conviction? So most states, including Colorado, have a mechanism to get back in court with new evidence of innocence. And then if a person can show that they could not reasonably have discovered this evidence earlier, and they are now bringing it to the court within, in a timely way once it's been discovered. And if they show that the outcome of their trial likely would have been different, that there's like a reasonable probability that the result would have been different if a jury had heard it, then, there's a standard that looks similar to that in most states that allow somebody to then come back in and try to overturn their conviction. So I would say the bulk of our work is in that space, where we're trying to come up with something new and get it before the court, and then get the court to overturn the conviction.
And you mentioned misidentification multiple times. Where does it fall? Under what category? Is it considered new evidence, or how can it be considered as new evidence? Because it's usually difficult to bring it.
I agree. I mean, when you have a case where there was what you think was a misidentification, it's kind of hard to come up with new evidence specifically about that. Like, I mean, there is some new science around eyewitness identification. So you can make an argument to a court that there's been sort of a change in the science of how we understand eyewitness identification. And if the jury had better understood through like expert testimony, what the real fallibility was of this identification based on how it happened, what the procedures were. There can sometimes be at least avenues you could try to get back in court by talking about how there's this deeper scientific understanding now of how misidentifications happen. But mostly in cases where there was a mistaken ID, what you're trying to do is develop other new evidence that would overwhelm that mistaken identification. So for example, there's a case that we have where there were multiple eyewitnesses who made IDs, but they're if you just look at them, the people originally picked out somebody else, and then, then they later shifted their position and picked out the defendant. Like, there's a lot of problems with the IDs. So like on their face, they're kind of problematic, but there are DNA avenues in that case. And so, that's a good example where, you might not be able to attack the IDs themselves because that was probably done at trial. But what you could do is, if there's physical evidence that you could now subject to DNA testing, you could use that as a way to prove the person's innocence in ways that completely overwhelm or trump the eyewitness evidence.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you can touch on the definition of beyond reasonable doubt and explain what does it mean for a jury to actually convict someone beyond reasonable doubt.
So I think there are a couple questions. What is the jury instruction, right? Like, what are jurors told? So I knew we were going to talk about this. So I pulled what Colorado's current model jury instruction is, and what it says is every person charged with a crime is presumed innocent. This presumption of innocence remains with the defendant throughout the trial and should be given effect by you unless, after considering all the evidence, you are convinced that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It talks about the prosecution carries the burden of proof. This burden requires more than proof that something is highly probable, but it does not require proof with absolute certainty. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. If you are firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt, then the prosecution has proven the crime charged beyond a reasonable doubt. So, there's instructions like that, give some guidance to a jury, but I think we could argue, might feel inadequate. Yeah, it's such an interesting question of how jurors apply that standard and how rigorous they are, and do they apply it differently in different cases? And one thing I think about a lot is when you have really horrific crimes, you how does that play into how the jury applies that standard? Because I think it's reasonable to ask, the jury just has this enormous responsibility. Are they going to risk letting a guilty person who did something really horrific, are they going to risk letting them go? Or are they more concerned with risking like a small chance that this person didn't do it? I think I'm not sure if people what sort of studies have been done to show how the gravity of the crime and the horrific nature of the crime might end up affecting sometimes what juries decide and how they apply that standard. I think there can be all sorts of unconscious bias that comes into how juries apply that standard. Um, I think it's a pretty complicated question.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, good opportunity to plug in 12 Angry Men as one of the best movies ever made, and also a great way. I think it should be mandatory for every jury in America actually
To watch it.
to watch this movie.
Yeah.
It's not just a great movie, it also just basically the whole movie is around reasonable doubt. What does that mean exactly?
Right, right. It makes you
Yeah.
really think about it.
Makes you really, really think about it because yeah, it's such a high threshold.
Right.
It's such a high threshold, and
Or it
yeah,
should be, right? I mean,
it should be.
think about the case that I talked about before of our client who did not have a tattoo on his hand.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why
Yeah.
wasn't that reasonable doubt? I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about. I mean, every case has complexities. Like I oversimplified the case a little bit in terms of the evidence they had, but it really did boil down primarily to this identification by the victim. And but that's pretty powerful when a victim gets up and says, "That's him, and I'm sure."
Yeah.
And then how does a jury feel in emotionally, even again if it's sort of at a subconscious level of rejecting her claim, and how that's pretty heavy. I mean, criminal cases are just really different in what's at stake. Um, and I think there's just a lot emotionally that goes into that decision that juries make.
Yeah, and I think we talked about a little bit, but the percentage of defendant that basically from the moment you enter, you set your foot in the door of the court, your likelihood of getting a conviction is extremely high. Most cases end up in conviction. Is that fair?
That's fair. So I pulled a couple of stats just in preparation for us talking. In state prosecutions, I think 94% of cases end in with a plea bargain. And in
Okay.
the federal system, I think it's 97 or 98%. So, I mean,
Mhm.
that's, right there, the bulk of people
Right.
are entering pleas. And, so that's part of the conviction rate, right? Because it results in a conviction. But, what we know from the DNA exonerations is that innocent people plead guilty to crimes. There's such a high trial penalty. If the prosecution comes to you and says, we'll give you probation, or you can risk going to trial and getting 20 years, a lot of people will say, let me just take probation. I don't want to risk going to
Mhm.
prison for 20 years. And I mean, that might seem like an extreme example, but that kind of disparity actually happens, right? And even if the disparity is less, people are just making a pragmatic decision knowing that they're up against the power of the state and what is likely to happen if they go to trial, even if they are innocent.
Yeah.
So it's innocent people absolutely plead guilty to crimes.
Yeah, and do we have an idea of how many presumably innocent people currently are in prison?
So there are people that have tried to study this, and it's difficult because you have known cases of wrongful conviction. And what we know is that has to be the tip of some iceberg. It's just kind of how big the iceberg is
Right.
beneath the surface, right? So there are people that have studied narrow sets of convictions like rape, where DNA was most likely in a certain era to be able to show like how many of those cases convictions were actually faulty. And then they sort of extrapolated out from there to give an estimate. And they find, I think the estimates are between like 2 and 6% of cases of where people are wrongfully convicted. So, when you apply that to a system in which across the country we incarcerate, thousands of people, it's a significant number.
Yeah, it's a huge number. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Um, okay, I want to ask you something, but after that we can also take it to whatever directions you want, because I think we touch on most of the key issues here. But I would like to ask, in a perfect world, how does a criminal justice system functions?
Wow.
How, because the reason I'm asking the question is this. I find that not just in this situation, but in any situation, when it comes to public policies, we tend to identify the problems. Rarely we identify the solutions. Or
Mm-hmm.
even if we think of a solution, sometimes we have best intentions, and those intentions, doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. And I am, I like the American system writ large. I think it's, the American Constitution is one of the best documents ever written. And obviously, from that, to go over the criminal justice system, of course, there's a lot of flaws, as we discussed and as you mentioned. But basically, my question, maybe alternatively, you can say, what is a good example of how a good criminal justice system, and especially when it comes to the issue of
Prosecutorial misconduct.
yes,
Um,
prosecutorial misconduct, and also the exoneration process, how
right.
tedious, and yeah. So if you can touch on that. I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot here, but
Okay. So I guess this is what I would say. I mean, you know, people can have all kinds of more structural critiques about the system. Like, are we incar- prosecuting and incarcerating too many people? Are we failing to deal with underlying inequities that feed the criminal legal system? Are we treating addiction more as a crime than a public health crisis? There's all these sort of things that you could look at on a structural level to have a critique, but like putting that aside and just assuming like we have this system and assuming you can't kind of change those structural things that are complex to talk about, like then within the system that we have, like what would be the most important things to do that would make a difference? I definitely think a better funded public defense system is critical. And when you look at caseloads of public defenders, it's often shameful how many cases public defenders carry. It is completely impossible for public defenders to serve every client at the level that they deserve when that public defender has such an astronomical caseload. Um, and it really varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But imagine right now if you had 100 felony cases in files on your desk, how would you do that? That's the truth of the life of many public defenders across the country. And we should be doing something about that. If we care about justice and we care about whether we get it right, then we have to be willing to fund the system at a level that gives everybody like that ensures some fairness and shows that it cares about accuracy. Another thing that I believe really strongly in is because forensics are such a big problem. I think, a solution that I don't know is politically feasible right now, but what really should be is that crime labs and that arm of the system is independent. and it's not under the police department. It's not under the
Right.
like law enforcement in any way. It's more of a neutral, independent agency that answers to both parties, right? That is as open with the defense as they are with the prosecution. There's all sorts of things that could then be done within crime labs to try to eliminate bias. There's huge problems with bias. So for example, we talk about these pattern comparison disciplines. There's a lot of science that shows that even if people believe they're acting in good faith, that you're more likely to kind of see what you expect and want to see, right? And so if you're looking at two fingerprints from a crime, you're looking at a supposed crime scene print, and you're looking at then reference prints from the suspect. The examiner should not know whether this is just a test question that's being randomly submitted to him by his supervisor, or if it's a print from a shoplifting case, or whether it's a print from a quadruple murder case. Because when they know that context, it can contaminate, their own analysis of the evidence. So, there's just like to me, that just seems like those two things feel super important to me. There's other things too, but I think funding the public defender system at levels that we're not currently doing it, and really revamping this whole system of forensics, where we demand more of each discipline and we house that part of the process in a truly independent agency. I think those things would make a huge difference.
Yeah, these are really great ideas. To have like an independent forensic body, basically, that is running this. Yeah, it's any other, because you mentioned we talk mostly about cases and exoneration processes and all that, but do you want to talk a little bit about the reforms that you're working towards?
Sure. So this last session in Colorado, we had a really successful session. Is we drafted and pushed a bill to make it easier for people to get DNA testing after they've been convicted. Colorado was a kind of an outlier nationally, in that the standard we had for people to be, that they had to kind of demonstrate, make a certain showing before they could even get DNA testing, was higher than most states. And so we lowered the standard, so it will make it easier for people to get DNA testing that could help prove their innocence. So that, I think, is huge and is going to help a lot of people. And then the other thing that we supported, it wasn't our bill, but we really threw our weight behind and gave testimony in support of, was a bill that prohibits police, well, it doesn't prohibit, it makes it harder for police to lie to juvenile suspects during interrogation. And where that came from is that juveniles are particularly vulnerable to giving false confessions. And the current state of the law, police can lie to any suspect about the evidence. They can tell a suspect, we found your DNA at the scene, so what you're telling us, that just doesn't add up. You might as well tell us the truth. And it's all part of an interrogation process that could go on for hours and wears somebody down, makes them feel like it's completely futile to resist. And they just want it to be over, and then people are vulnerable to giving false confessions. So, we continue to chip away. We have an agenda going forward. I think this session we're going to push a bill that would make the clemency process more transparent, so that when somebody applies to clemency with the governor, that the governor's office is required to have greater transparency about that process and its decision making, the timeliness of petitions before the governor, and then different aspects of the decision.
Yeah. Well, this is super important work.
Oh, thanks. Well,
no, what you guys are like, what you're doing is you really save people's lives. That's how I look at it. And when I look into some of the cases, this is what is so frustrating. The fact that we don't necessarily think about it this way, but these are actual people, and these are actual lives that are they're being deprived of their freedom. I don't think it's something that we can actually contemplate in our brains, what it means when people with guns come to your house and put you in a different location, and you have no ability to do anything, that you take for granted on your day-to-day life. So what you are doing at the Korey Wise Innocence Project is truly, you take some of those folks and you return them to, you bring them back to life in kind of way.
Yeah.
This is how I see it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, it is really important for their lives and their entire families. I definitely have seen that in the cases I've worked on, is just um, how many lives are affected by a wrongful conviction. And then on the flip side, if we are able to free a person, the healing that creates in so many lives, the ripple out effect. But, as I mentioned before, I think also, one of the big contributions of Innocence Projects as a whole is not only like specific reforms that we've achieved, but also just really changing the conversation about the criminal legal system. I mean, maybe for some people it's kind of hard to remember, but, in the past, let me think how many years it's been now, 30 plus years since DNA has been a tool, and we've just seen all of these news stories, right? Like we all have seen them, of the people walking out of prison after like 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. I mean, there's cases where people have walked out after like that many decades in prison, and they're powerful. And I think it really has shifted the conversation that we have about the criminal legal system. I think there's a much deeper awareness, partly because of these cases, of the problems within the system and people's concern about that.
Yeah. I would like to ask if you know, I don't know if you know this, but because it's such even when you get out of prison after being wrongfully convicted, and depending on how much time you spend there, but that in and of itself, it is such a tough process for anyone to go back to reality and reestablish their lives. I believe that some of them can't do that, which is the tragedy of this situation as well. There's another element to that.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, you see it play out really differently for different people. But, there's just such a range of what that can look like. So you have people that come out of prison with no family to come back to. We have a client right now that all of his family has passed away since he went in. When he comes out, he has a couple of friendships that he's maintained over his time in prison, but he, hopefully will get him out, and he'll be coming out 30 years later to no family structure, like no community really to welcome him. But then, you have people on the other side, like our client, Jason, who just got out in May. He made a lot of strong connections while he was in prison with different organizations that were coming in and doing different programs with people in prison. And he started a job with one of these organizations right when he got out. They were able to help him find an apartment. He has amazing family support. He's doing really well. But for a lot of people, it's really hard. There's, people sometimes suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. There are people, when you hear them interviewed, say they worry about being anywhere without there being some sort of record about where they are. Like they're constantly thinking of, what's my alibi now? Like, because they still worry about, they know how easily things can go wrong, and they carry that fear with them, even years later. So yeah, it just, it really looks different ways for different people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Anne-Marie.
Thank
If
you.
you have anything else you want to say, please go ahead.
Well, I guess I just encourage people to get involved. There are innocence projects all over the US, and there's something called the Innocence Network. And I think it's innocencenetwork.org. And you can go on there, and they have kind of a map of the US and even other parts of the world. And they show, which projects operate in which states and regions. And a lot of innocence projects have really great social media that you can follow and learn more about these issues. So I would just encourage folks to get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thank you so much for taking the time, and again, thank you for everything that you do. And we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you, Evie.
Thank you.